so welcome to this week's episode of the Python People podcast, the home for global leaders and to share technology insights. And my name's Guy Bevington. I'm the MD of True North Recruitment Group. And this week I'm delighted to be joined by Bhairav Patel, CTO of Atom Ventures. Bhairav, a warm welcome. How are you doing today?
Many thanks. I am a little bit cold, but I'm all right.
Yeah, it's bitter. I went for a run earlier on. It was took me about 20 minutes to warm up, but that's British weather for you, I suppose. So yeah, Bhairav, I guess to frame today's episode. So when we got chatting a while back now, it became really apparent, I think, quite quickly that you're somebody who has not only established and built technology functions from scratch multiple times throughout your career, but you've actually managed to achieve that in multiple countries and multiple locations globally. And I guess the world that we're all living in now, that we've all been thrust into as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that concept of the location of workforce, on-site versus remote, and onshore versus nearshore versus offshore, etc. It's become a lot more front and center for a lot of companies' strategy moving forward. So we thought there could definitely be a lot of value to share around your experiences insofar as what international strategies have worked well for you, and versus in retrospect what you may potentially have done different if you had your time again. So we thought let's have a little chat about it and see what insights come out of it, I guess. So before we delve into that and get to the nitty gritty, do you want to start by just telling us a bit about yourself and your sort of career bio to date?
Sure. So I started in 1999, so that's 22 years ago. So that's a fair amount of time. I started off at PwC, then IBM, and with PwC I managed to travel around quite a bit. So one of my very first projects, or my very first project actually, was in Lithuania. So I spent 2 years out in Lithuania from 99 to 2001ish. And from there I went to Norway, lived out in Norway for 11 years. I was CTO for a privately owned e-commerce business, the largest privately owned e-commerce business out there. We took that, and it was an interesting place to be because it had been running for a few years, was a startup, and essentially grew really too quickly. So, and the guy who's in charge of the business, very, very intelligent guy, but was one of these people that, really felt like he felt his community, and he really wanted to he felt a part of his community, but he also really wanted to kind of give back to his community. And so when I got in there, it was one of those situations where he had 3 people doing one person's job. So we had to do kind of a radical change there. But what was great about that was that we built the tech team up over the 5 years I was there, and we made that an international team. So that was great. And then from there, I ended up at a fintech where it was actually someone I knew who had started a business, raised $12 million back in 2012 for a fintech. So this is before fintechs or the whole fintech craze really existed. And we took that into a global business, launched actually into 40 different countries on day one, but then had operations in the US, Ireland, Singapore, South Africa. So that built up over another 4 years or so. And then there's an interesting story about how that ended, and that's a whole story for startup founders and this, that, and the other. But from there, I ended up going to Bangkok, building a team for a friend's company. He was a rapidly scaling business, so it was odd. He had about 4,000 people working in the business across all the different countries, and only 5 in IT, and 3 of them were part-time. So it was all a bit mad. So I ended up going in there to try and bolster that team and scale that. So I built that, and then eventually started Atom Ventures. And with Atom Ventures, what we've been doing is helping startups and small businesses with their technology by providing virtual CTO services and development as well. So what we tend to do there is we go in early stage to a company that doesn't necessarily have a tech person within that company, so anyone technical will go in, help set the roadmap strategy, and then execute that. So either we will build the technology ourselves, or we use a network of our partners to do that. And as they grow, we'll help them add more people into the team. We'll manage that team until they get to that investment stage. And a few of the companies that we've worked with have raised significant Series A that they've just gone on then to hire their own CTOs, and then we help them hire those CTOs. So that's great. And we've been doing that now for the last 3 years. And that is international as well. So we've got clients all over the world for that.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for that. That's a very impressive CV there. And yeah, I guess what's quite apparent already is, there has been that real international theme, sort of core thread, I guess, running throughout all of your ventures. So initially, is that something that's always been intentional for you, or did it sort of just happen by, osmosis of being in the right place at the right time and sort of seeing the virtues of international versus domestic functions?
So I guess when you're joining someone like PwC, it's very international to begin with, right? Especially because back in those days, you're working with teams and the way they would work. So on that Lithuanian telecoms project that we worked on, you had a big contingent from the UK, but you also had people coming in from PwC Poland, PwC Latvia. So you had people from all over Europe coming into those projects. And similarly, when I was in Norway, and Norway was a little bit different in that mostly Norwegians working for PwC out there. But we did have, we were the Brits in Norway working on those. So I think from my very first projects, we were always internationally, the teams were always international. They weren't, it wasn't in the same way as you have now where you're having the nearshoring, offshoring, right? That developed over time. So when PwC got bought, so the PwC consulting piece got bought by IBM, that's when, we got introduced to the whole outsourcing model in India. And I actually went out early 2000s to Bangalore to help set up some of the teams for the project that we were working on in the UK. So I spent some time in training the teams out in India for how they work. So I've been doing that outsourcing model for at least 20 years now. Wow. So yeah, it all came because of that background. And then when I went into the smaller companies, well, I say smaller, but they were still fairly large for the countries they're in. It wasn't a situation that I knew wanted to make them international, but the thing for me was that I'd seen how it worked, so I wasn't against it. And what I see now with some clients that we work with is that they're very against having not necessarily remote teams, but working even with different cultures. And I think I always take it for granted, having worked in different countries, that you can do it. But I forgot there are other people who've never ever really dealt with anyone from anywhere else, and so they think it's a huge hurdle when it really isn't.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, certainly from a lot of conversation, it sounds like you've been in environments where, clearly you've had to go and make it work, and obviously been very instrumental in making it work. But it sounds like it has worked, and there's a lot of CEOs and MDs I speak to that sort of initial opening gambit. It does feel quite inherent and fraught with risk with a lot of them. And are quite adverse to doing it because, like I said, I've never done it before, and so yeah, I guess it's quite interesting to share your perspectives on that and allay any of those potential sort of falsehoods or concerns. So I guess on that note, having successfully established technology functions globally, what strategies can you share that have worked for you essentially?
So we've really I've always gone to those countries. So when you want to hire someone from abroad, you'll do a bit of research, because now it's a very different landscape today than it was 20 years ago, right? Essentially 20 years ago, you were looking at pretty much India as the main outsourcing hub, and you weren't looking anywhere else. Whereas now I'm working with teams in South Africa, you've got Vietnamese teams, Chinese teams, as well as all of the European teams that have popped up around Poland and Spain and Portugal and places like Latvia, Lithuania as well. So one thing I realized is that in order for it to be successful is that you have to essentially spread out your culture to whichever team is working for you, no matter where they are in the world. And you really can't do that unless you go there and visit. Now, obviously, COVID, it's a bit harder to go and see someone go out and bring people, or even bring people across. But you still need to build that cultural connection slightly, because working in somewhere like India is very different to working somewhere like Australia, New Zealand. So we had teams in New Zealand, right? And it's much easier to get on with someone from New Zealand because, there's a lot of, especially if you're British, there's a lot of cultural similarities. Yeah. In India, there isn't. And I think you need to put yourself a little bit in the shoes there, because you are hiring people at the end of the day. You're not just hiring a CV of talent and what they've done on previous projects. You have to understand a little bit about their motivations and why it is that they want to work for you. And it's, I guess you shouldn't really see it any differently than hiring someone in your own country, right? Because you want to show your culture, show what you can offer, how the experience will be, how you'll grow the talent. It should really be the same as when you're hiring a nearshoring or offshoring team. Now, of course, you may look at it differently if it's a shorter term engagement, whether it's a 3-month project, 4-month project, but very rarely do you see 3-month projects that last only for 3 months, right? They tend to go on and on and on, and then 3 months turns into 3 years. So if you go in with the mindset that the people that we're going to hire, we're going to need to to deal with them over a longer term basis, then you act as if you're hiring them in, to sit in your office. And I think that's the key. And what I did is, if I couldn't physically go out there because I was busy being CTO, then I'd send some of my senior team, and we would always have initial calls with the people to understand a little bit more about the culture rather than just about the person, because I think that's the only way it really works, if you understand how people work on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess fingers crossed, if we're on the way out of the woods with the pandemic now, hopefully, touch wood, that becomes a bit more easy to actually sort of forecast getting people on ground in future. But yeah, I can imagine for companies for the last year trying to build out some kind of international presence and build that culture purely remotely, purely digitally, it must be really difficult. What kind of cultural elements do you think need to be taken into account, based on your experiences when choosing to build a team in another country versus locally?
So again, it goes down to a lot of the motivations of people that are working for you. So as you mentioned, it is hard creating a remote culture, but if you're a business that was established pre-COVID, you already had a culture, right? And if you weren't able to keep that culture as a remote, as everyone was working remotely, then you're going to struggle doing that with people that you've never met before in a different country, right? But if you've managed to kind of keep that cohesive and maintain that culture as a company now during COVID, then there should be no reason why you aren't able to do that for people in other countries. So there are, a lot of it comes down to the really, really weird, like your day-to-day things. So, for example, we're hiring in India at the moment, and we've trebled our size or doubled our size over COVID, and we've been hiring, we're setting up a company out there, we're hiring people out there. And, I've been outsourcing in India for many years, so I've kind of always assumed that I knew the motivation. But then, I'm an old man now, and one thing I in my mindset is still from 20 years ago, where actually the motivations of the youth of today is very different. And one of the things that you'll find is that, let's say India, for example, some of the younger generation really aren't motivated so much by money, but they need other things. So it'll be training, it'll be a great work-life balance. They don't want to be working on 15 different projects at once. And some of the senior guys will be more interested in their titles, right? So they'll want to know, what title am I going to get? They'll be obviously concerned about money, but a lot of them will be understanding, after I have this title, have this amount of additional pay rise onto my pay packet. And because there are so many jobs in the market, it's easy for people to pop from one place to another. So you then got to think about what kind of people you're trying to attract. Is it just based on money? So we've actually started looking at women trying to get back into the workforce, because there's a lot of highly intelligent people out in India in general, but there's a lot of women who go out and they don't get much support from maternity wise or paternity wise in India at the moment anyway, right? But you can, but they're all there wanting to get back into work. And so, we recently hired a number of women who are looking to get back in the workforce, which is great, because they're there. They tend to be a little bit of overlooked minority out there, and even in this country, everywhere in general, really. So again, you're looking at what we were looking there was motivations. Why do they want to work? And again, it's for something stable. They want to make sure that they're getting their stable project work. It's going to be a 9 to 5, et cetera, et cetera. So then you take this over to somewhere like Portugal, where I had an outsourced team. Similar things, right? So what do people want to work? The market is really, really hot in Portugal. What is going to attract them? It's not going to be money, because there's loads of people paying money. And in Portugal, you have this kind of really weird situation, like a lot of European countries, where the more you get paid, the less you take home in some circumstances, because of the way the tax system works. So really for them, it's going to be other benefits, right? It could be benefits like company cars, or it could be paid, not paid holidays, but, paying for certain things. So you may be going out for meals or whatever it is, and having a good team spirit, being able to have that flexibility working from home. So again, you can't just assume that everyone is motivated by the same things that you're motivated by. And I think that's one of the key things I think everyone should take away, really.
Yeah. So I guess the key, really, what you're saying there is to actually research, and understand what culture it is you're setting there. Not like I say, not assume. Just because obviously what drives people in the UK is going to be the same in other countries. Clearly, it is going to be very different. And I guess that's good management in many ways, isn't it? Just understanding the psychology of somebody and actually what drives them. So yeah, it makes total sense. Are there any kind of success stories that you can share where you feel that the specific choice around the location of where you decided to build the team was actually a really pivotal part of why the project was a success or a failure? I guess a success or a failure based on how you see the outcome of the initiative. But yeah, are there any specific any areas where you think that the location was quite instrumental?
So I think, again, it comes a little bit down to the people, right? So I think one of the best things that we did was in Aztec when we set up our operations, so our IT operations people overlooking the platform that we built in the US, had our main dev team in Portugal, and some guys were in Latvia and India as well. And then we had all our business analysts and testing team in Ireland. So that was a nice little bridge, right? So time wise, Ireland, Portugal makes sense. Even Latvia is only an hour out. And then because of the operational piece, a lot of our customers were in North and South America. So that made much more sense rather than us having to deal with that operational piece on this side of the world. That was good. But also it was interesting in that each country, there was a certain demographic that I could aim for because I knew they'd stay loyal to the business and they weren't really hunting around for money. So in Portugal, what it was that the guys that we ended up hiring were all family people, right? And so they wanted something stable. We could give them something stable. We could pay them well, and we knew that they weren't going to run around and chase the next new shiny project because there's so much happening in that place, right? They weren't necessarily interested in going off, oh, I want to do blockchain now. Oh, I want to do some React development. Or I want to do that. They liked what we were doing. We were expanding business. We were growing. We had that. And in the US, I managed to find the demographic of the people who were a little bit older. So I guess more around my age, in the 40s. And again, it wasn't necessarily that they were ambitious people, but they needed to have a 9 to 5 in the sense that, they had kids to pick up and drop off and a bunch of different things that they had going on in their lives. And so they were willing to take a little bit less, let's say, than the young blood that was coming up and really moving fast. But again, they wanted stability, right? So for them, it was, we weren't going to call them on weekends. We weren't going to, ask them to work every day of the week. And so for them, it was that, again, that was the cultural piece for them that was important. And you hit the right note with everyone. Because you had enough youngsters and older people in the team, it was nicely balanced across all of the different countries. So it was a good mixture of age and experience. With one, I think, where we stretched a little bit too far was in Norway, where we set up a 24/7 development. So I had developers in New Zealand, India, Norway, and the US. So that was that it kind of worked, but I never slept. That was a problem. We always there was always a question from someone coming in at some point in time, and so I realized that was a little bit of a step too far. So we got rid of the US bit and we just stayed with New Zealand, because it was a nice idea to be able to shift a piece of work and have it continuously be worked on, but ultimately, then you as a boss, you never get to sleep, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yes, that's the thing, isn't it? Like, just genuinely logistically, that time difference, I think for lots of people I speak to, that is just the biggest blocker in terms of where they choose. Because I know for a fact, if you're in the UK working in West Coast of the States, for instance, like culturally, in many ways, you've probably got a lot in common. It would make a lot of sense to try and forge that partnership. But just from a business logistics point of view, that time zone is pretty brutal, the difference, isn't it?
So what I'd add on that actually is that, and this is probably another thing that's quite key, is that you got to know what you're outsourcing or nearshoring, right? So the reason that the US, Portugal, Ireland worked, it was because every single place, every division, if you want to call it for want of a better term, was had its own autonomy, right? So each team could do its own thing and make its own decisions. So the problem with Norway when we were doing the 24/7 life cycle was that people would depend on each other. So it wasn't, you might have been working on slightly different areas of the platform, but they were all interconnected anyway. So if you did something in one place, you wouldn't want to ask a question to someone else in somewhere else. Whereas in Aztec, when we were doing, when we had the teams in the US, Portugal, and Ireland, was that each of those teams could handle everything by themselves, but they would need to coordinate only once or twice a day, right? We wouldn't necessarily need to coordinate every day. So there would be, the processes worked better, right? Because there was a process in place for us to talk to each other when we needed to talk to each other. And if there was a decision to be made, they had a certain level of autonomy. And that was very important. I think that's one of the things people mix up a little bit, is they try and do too much with the teams and trying to, if you yes, it's nice to have 3 people in Portugal and 2 people in London sitting doing a sprint together, but that's a great time zone. But if you want to do the same thing with India, it's not going to work, right? You need that team in India to be independent of anyone in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that kind of probably leads me into my next question around how do you feel it works best in terms of the structure of a team internationally? If you know you're set on the idea of doing some kind of international presence, what would you say is best to have the split between? Is it always better to have a certain number of or a certain proportion you feel in HQ, or is that not necessarily that important, and actually you can have more based externally? What's your thoughts on where you sort of location and structure of a team?
Well, the great thing is there's no such thing as HQ anymore, is there? Really, post COVID, depending on what your philosophy is. I think it's more around the process piece, right? So your team needs to be able to make a decision on something if you are not available to answer straight away. And that's pretty much with any kind of IT team, right? Any technical team if you're working in agile methodology, they should just know what they need to do and get on with it. And you should be speaking to them every couple of weeks once there's a sprint zero. And in between all that, if they've got questions to ask, it shouldn't be time critical, right? It shouldn't be something that needs to be answered straight away. Where things get a little bit hairy is operations. So that was a little bit more interesting, because how do we deal with when we had customers at Aztec let's say that were in Singapore, Chile and the US and Spain, and they're all got problems at the same time. We didn't have teams in lots of different locations because that was a problem. Sorry, I didn't have tech teams in all lots of different locations because that would have just got ridiculously expensive, right? And people would have just been being 1 or 2 men or women teams out there not doing very much. And so you had to then have that process in place that there was someone at least in country that could deal with first line support, that we would buy us some time for the back end support. So I still think the way it works is having the autonomy, having the structure, having communications, right? Because the key is you can't let people alone for too long. And I know that I said you don't have to speak every day, but you do need to have some sort of linkage within the team so that people are at least chatting and feeling that they're part of a wider organization. Because what you can get, and this can happen in a single country, right? I've seen it happen where you've got lots of locations in the same country full of developers. You can find that one office ends up just going off in a different way than the others. And so unless there's some constant communication, you need to have some sort of camaraderie. You need to have some people just talking to each other, right? Sharing knowledge, doing some fun stuff together, which is what you would do in a remote team now, which I know a lot of people are doing during COVID. It's those same principles of managing a remote team that you have with developers.
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, you mentioned COVID there, and clearly COVID's been an absolute game changer, for a lot of companies, whether they like it or not, whether it was on the roadmap or not. They've been forced into the situation where they've kind of had to make remote work. And I think, the difference is quite interesting. Actually, I speak to a lot of leaders now. I think the difference of where we are now, the beginning of the first lockdown, I think there was definitely this kind of blasé attitude a little bit let's just wait for it all to blow over and then we'll basically just go back to the way we were. But obviously, because the situation's gone on for such a prolonged period of time now, I think a lot of companies have had no choice but to fundamentally re-engineer their processes and their working practices to actually allow people to work remotely moving forward. So I guess I do see that as one quite big positive thing off the back of a not very nice 12 months. There's been a sort of fundamental shift forward in terms of possible remote working. What do you think that now spells out for the future of kind of international strategy? And now what would be the virtues of taking an employee remotely in the UK versus actually spinning up a new team in a new country? How do you think COVID's kind of changed that dynamic?
There's this thing I saw on LinkedIn the other day, which I thought it was just fantastic, but I don't know who sent it, and I wish I'd shared it. But it shows a graph of salaries for the same job, same year in different countries, right? So let's say, for example, you're a .NET developer for 6 years, and in the UK you might be getting paid 80, 90 grand, but in South Africa you might be getting paid 20 grand, right? And what was interesting was that the guy was basically saying that now, essentially, just because you're paid a lot in a certain country doesn't mean your value is that, because someone in another country might be paying less. Okay, they may have a salary which is high for their country, and it doesn't compare to yours, but it doesn't mean that you are worth $1 million if you're being paid $1 million, right? There's someone else out there who can do your job. And what I think he said this, but it's something that, piqued my interest, was because talent is everywhere around the world. And so if you're clever about it and you're organized and you've got the right processes in place, you can take advantage of that talent no matter where it is. So I was recently giving I was part of a panel discussion in South Africa to a organization called Geek Culture. And they've got thousands of students in South Africa, but also tens of thousands across Africa that they link together and try to get them to internships and working with companies in any shape or form, so that once they graduate and get into the workplace, they've got a bit of experience, which obviously makes them much more interesting. And one of the key things that a couple of the guys said there, and I echoed, was that the competition is global, right? If you're a developer in any country, you should be thinking on a global level that you're competing not just with dude down the road or dude down the next city. You're competing with someone halfway across the world. Because for someone in, let's say, Cape Town to change his working hours, it's not a lot. It's only a couple of hours, right? If that needs to be aligned. And even with India, you get it a lot. It's been happening for many years. People just shift their working hours to align if they needed to. So, I think that's, if you're a business now looking to get the best for the money that you can afford, so you're essentially getting the cost, I won't say cost effective, but the most for bang for your buck, you should be looking to go anywhere. And if you can manage people remotely in the UK, you can manage people anywhere in the world, right? Yeah. It's just, you can be organized with it. So I think this is a great thing. And I think it'll be good for, I'm not going to say it's going to reduce wages in this country. I can't see that happening because and look at the US, they're nuts. If you look at some of the salaries out there, but I think it will improve standards elsewhere. And I'm not saying that we should all be improving standards elsewhere, but it does mean that there'll be more money put in to educating people in technology and STEM or whatever it is. And that, I think, is really good. That's really exciting, because that means it's more money means more interest, means you'll get more, the brightest will go there. If you look at MBAs, I think it's been for the last 5-10 years, maybe it's at least the 5 years, where MBA students, they're more likely to become founders and entrepreneurs than they are to go into investment banking, which is what it was previously, right? Which is great, because the talent's going into the right place where you can make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like it's opened up the restricting factors that were there before, hasn't it? And kind of really leveled the playing field globally, I guess, which is really exciting. Because I mean, even for us thinking about kind of international expansion now, it suddenly makes it a lot more feasible, because you haven't necessarily got those initial huge setup costs that you normally would traditionally have had with setting up a recruitment business internationally, going on over, generally speaking, in recruitment, and understandably, actually to kind of meet people face to face, it's a big key part of the role. But now we do thankfully have technology like this. Whilst it's never going to fully replicate the quality of interaction you get face to face, it is incredibly helpful. To actually beg the question: do you really need to kind of land before you expand? Do you actually need to go fork out all this money to go and get an office set up in New York before you actually go and start working in the New York market? And quite frankly, I think the answer is no, you don't have to.
No, you don't. And I think if you look at, especially what you do, if it was me, I'd be saying, well, hang on. There's talent pool in the UK, need to make that, nurture that, of course, and in Europe. But then why not go to someone like the guys in South Africa, Geek Culture, who've got, a few thousand people there that you can talk to. And then it makes your business more interesting, right? In the sense that you can say to these guys, well, yes, we've got X, Y, and Z data scientists, but actually we've also got these guys who are studying at University of Cape Town and are interested in initial job placement, but then, and they're not going to be, they'll be a little bit cheaper.
Yeah.
But you may need to nurture them. And I think that's really, I think, is quite interesting and exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's giving a better service, isn't it? It's just giving more options. And I think that's the thing that often people look for. So I totally agree with you. I guess on that note, I mean, how do you feel the last 12 months has impacted things specifically for the UK? Obviously, where we live right now, what do you think the roadmap is looking like for the technology landscape in the UK off the back of the last 12 months?
It's been a weird one, isn't it? Because we've been starting and stopping for a while now. And I think at the beginning of the year, it seemed like there was going to be a big push, and it kind of stopped, didn't it? So January, everyone was really hectic. It was a bit mad. And then it kind of stopped mid-Feb, and then March was a little bit dry because I think everyone was thinking we're going back into the next. Well, we were in the next lockdown, and April now is picking up again, where people are having conversations. There was a bit of doom and gloom, wasn't there? Really, at the start of the pandemic, when people were being laid off, and there was a lot of developers out there. But I don't think it took them too long to find jobs, because I think the people with money just sucked them up. So I do know that people who are trying to hire now in the UK are finding it very difficult, because there's not that many people around who are available, and those who are able to demand a price. I think the other problem that you got is we've got the 3-month not garden leave, but notice period here in the UK, right? Which causes a huge amount of problem, because most people need technology now. I've only very rarely come across people that've asked me, "Oh, we want to do this project in 6 months' time." Right? They're like, "I need it in 3 weeks." That's okay. So, but I think it's pretty bullish. I do think we'll bounce back into technology. I don't think we really ever went away with technology, right? But I think there will be more demand. Whether we'll be able to satisfy that demand or not, I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think as I think I was just saying recently, recruitment's always a supply and demand paradigm, and it's always really interesting to see how that sort of skews one way or t'other. But yeah, I do think the next 12 months are going to be really telling in terms of kind of how it all pans out on that supply demand paradigm. Certainly, we've seen that huge shift just in the last 3 months alone. From now, thankfully, we've got this roadmap back to normality. A lot of companies starting to take the brakes off and really kickstarting some very kind of ambitious hiring plans, which I guess is nice for us. But it presents new challenges, doesn't it? So I think your point though about looking internationally and offering services for international consultancies and agencies is a very sensible approach as well. So something we'll definitely look to do. So I guess just sort of lastly bringing it back onto the actual topic of tech, and from your perspective as a CTO going in and mapping out, defining technical strategy and looking what kind of technology to implement. I know it's always going to be the right tool for the right job, I guess, but in terms of where you are most excited now about the future of tech, and what kind of tech initiatives you're really passionate about and keen to get your teeth into, what do you what's floating your boat at the moment, what's getting you fired up?
It's interesting that, because I was going through the Gartner hype curve. I don't know if you know about that.
No.
There's a thing called the Gartner hype curve. So every year they put together a graph that essentially talks about, lists all the technology and trends that are out there in the technology world that are being talked about a lot. So the ones that have a great hype. What tends to happen is that there's this huge spike in hype, and lots of people are very, very interested in it, and everyone's talking about it. And then the curve just kind of, it's like a very flattened bell curve. So it's peaked bell curve. Sorry, it just drops dramatically, because what people figure out is that, well, this is all hype. It's not really, there's nothing I can do with it. It's either expensive, or when you try and apply it, it doesn't do exactly the things that you need. And then what happens is it tapers off and comes back again, because after about 12 months time, people have realized, well, actually we use this technology for that. And then it starts building up again, but at a much more sustainable way. So if you look at so a good example is gamification. So gamification, I don't know if you remember, but 5-6 years ago, everything was going to be gamified, right? Our lives were going to be gamified, everything we do. Microsoft bought a company called Yammer for ridiculous amounts of money. And then Yammer disappeared. Nothing got gamified. And we were like, all right, what happens now? Whereas now what you're seeing is that people are using gamification within, obviously not just games, but obviously in learning tools. So if you want to teach kids about X, Y, and Z things, you're creating apps to gamify that experience. You're gamifying training. So we know some companies right now that are doing training through gamification. There's a whole bunch and even investment. So the whole Robin Hood is gamified investment, right? So what's on the hype curve at the moment is AI and machine learning. So everything is AI and machine learning, and we're seeing a lot of that coming through. And what I'm seeing is there's a lot of very, very interesting applications of what people want to do with machine learning. There's a whole argument as to whether what people are trying to do is AI or not, and that's a different debate that can take forever. But we are seeing a lot more interesting projects in that, where it is stuff that will actually make it. You're not just looking to try and trigger what someone should buy next, right? You're looking at real world applications. So there's one company that we've been talking to who are using natural language processing to improve the written test scores of kids whose first language is in English, right? And so, because exams are about 80% written. So there's stuff like that which is out there, especially in the ed tech sector, which is cool. But I think really what the fact that we're getting more of these companies coming to us points to a bigger trend, and a bigger thing that I think is really exciting is a democratization of tech. So what you're finding is it's easier and easier nowadays to set up technology at a very basic level. So if you want to run machine learning algorithms, you can go to Google, Azure, AWS, and you can run things out of the box. You don't need a data science team initially. Of course, you do need people to have a strategy and plan, etc., in place, but you can get this done. Now, it won't differentiate you and it can get expensive, but it means you can test out things. The whole low code, no code movement, which again had a lot of hype, is coming into itself now, I think, where people are able to start building at least prototypes themselves just to see how it is. And I don't think it takes away necessarily from things that we do. I think it's actually a good thing because people then realize how difficult it is to design and build and maintain these apps, and there are limitations. But I think the fact that now people can touch and feel technology much more easily than they could before, that will open up a whole set of new trends or open new paths, really, and allow people to understand how can tech be used within their lives or to change things. So I think that I think is interesting. I think there's a whole bunch of different things coming together that will helpfully open up technology to a wider audience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I guess that's what we're all aware of the AI bubble, aren't we, and how it's sort of interfacing with our lives. But I guess in reality, that is what technology is there for. It's to solve problems for the masses on scale, isn't it? And that'd be really interesting to see how that does sort of extrapolate out into our everyday lives moving forward. But fantastic. Well, lovely to speak to you. I've really enjoyed the chat, and I think you shared a huge amount of value today, and really interesting to hear your kind of different opinions and approaches on international versus domestic tech. I guess nothing remains for me to say thank you, and wish you all the very best for the future.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's been great to be on this side of the mic, as they say.
Good man. All right. See you soon.
Cheers.
Okay. Bye.